Welcome to my channel, Crimson Inquiry.
It was upon a bleak and tempestuous night in late November of the year 1893 that I first heard of the singular affair which was to become known as the Lighthouse murder. The wind had howled down Baker Street since the early hours, and the gas lamps flickered fitfully against the panes. Struggling in vain to pierce the shroud of fog that clung to London like a pall, Sherlock Holmes, wrapped in his long dressing gown, sat cross-legged in his armchair before the fire, the faint blue tendrils of cigarette smoke rising about his hawk-like profile. His eyes were closed, yet his fingers moved restlessly, tapping against one another in that curious rhythm which I had long come to associate with the machinery of his mind in motion. For my part, had buried myself in the evening edition of the Times, hoping to distract my thoughts from the gloom without, when a brief column of print caught my attention: mysterious death at Beachy Head Lighthouse. The keeper of the Beachy Head Lighthouse, Mr. Enoch Graves, was found dead yesterday morning within the lamp chamber, under circumstances of a most puzzling nature. The body bore signs of a violent struggle, yet the chamber was locked from within. Authorities are at a loss to explain the means by which the assailant could have escaped. Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard has been dispatched to assist the local constabulary. I read the report aloud, glancing up to see whether Holmes had taken note. He had not stirred, but I fancied that his fingers' tapping grew ever so slightly more rapid. "A locked room murder, Holmes," said I, folding the paper. "It appears to be quite beyond explanation. A lighthouse, no less." At that his eyes opened, and a faint smile played upon his thin lips. "My dear Watson," said he, "when the ordinary observer declares a thing to be beyond explanation, that is when the explanation lies most readily within reach, provided one observes correctly." He rose abruptly, paced twice before the hearth, and then halted. "Beachy Head, you say? A lighthouse murder, locked from within, Lestrade in attendance." He glanced toward the mantel clock. "We shall take the morning train from Victoria. I fancy the Sussex air will do us both good." I stared. "You mean to investigate, then?" "Indubitably," said Holmes. "There is, I believe, more light to be found in a lighthouse than meets the common eye." And with that cryptic remark, he drew his violin from its case and began to play a soft, haunting strain that mingled curiously with the rising storm. As I gazed into the fire, I could not shake the feeling that somewhere, amid the crashing surf and lonely cliffs of Beachy Head, awaited one of the strangest and most perilous adventures of our long association. The following morning dawned grey and cold, with a bitter wind sweeping along the Thames and rattling the window panes of Baker Street. Holmes was already astir when I descended to breakfast, standing by the window with his violin laid aside and a cup of coffee untouched at his elbow. His keen grey eyes were fixed upon the street below, though from his expression I suspected that his thoughts were far from London altogether. "Our train leaves Victoria at 9:45, Watson," said he briskly as I entered. "We shall have ample time to reach Beachy Head by mid-afternoon, if the railway behaves in a manner even approximating to human intelligence. A doubtful prospect, I grant you." Mrs. Hudson appeared with our breakfast, and I could not but remark the air of quiet excitement about Holmes. There was a peculiar sharpness in his manner, which I had come to recognize as the prelude to a case that had captured his imagination. Though I had accompanied him on many such journeys, I confess that a sense of anticipation quickened my own spirits. The words "locked room" had a magical sound to Holmes, and their mere mention seemed to light a fire within him. We left Baker Street shortly after 8, the fog lying thick over the streets and the rattle of the cab's wheels echoing through the damp morning air. Holmes, wrapped in his long travelling coat, sat opposite me, his chin resting upon his hands, and his gaze lost somewhere beyond the misted window. For many minutes he remained silent. Then, quite suddenly, he spoke. "Watson," said he, "what do you make of a man who dies violently in a lighthouse, one of the most inaccessible spots in all England, and whose murderer vanishes from a chamber locked and barred from within?" I considered the question. "It suggests to me, Holmes, either suicide or some mechanical contrivance by which the assailant might have escaped unseen." "Ah." Holmes's eyes brightened with approval. "You have at least placed your feet upon the correct path. Yet suicide is excluded by the details of the report. Signs of a violent struggle, I believe you read aloud. That one phrase is sufficient to destroy the theory of self-inflicted death. And as for mechanical contrivance, well, that will depend upon our inspection. There is an artistry to murder, Watson, and the finest artists choose their materials with cunning precision. I wish to see the brushstrokes myself before I pass judgment upon the painter." We arrived at Victoria amidst the bustle of porters and passengers, and by the time our train steamed out of London, the morning had lifted somewhat, revealing a pale strip of sunlight breaking through the fog. Holmes leaned back, his eyes half closed, and for a time I imagined he slept. Yet when I chanced to glance at him, I saw that he had produced from his pocket a folded telegram and was studying it with the utmost concentration. "It is from Lestrade," he said, catching my glance. "He has gone ahead to the Lighthouse and reports that the local constabulary are thoroughly at sea. The body was discovered at dawn by the assistant keeper, a certain Mr. George Penrose. The door to the lamp chamber was locked from the inside, the key found within the dead man's pocket, and all windows secured. The unfortunate Graves lay near the great lens, his skull fractured by a blunt instrument. No weapon has been recovered." "Extraordinary," I murmured. "If the key was in his pocket, and the door truly fastened from within, how could any person have entered or left?" "That, my dear Watson," Holmes replied, "is precisely the sort of question that warms the cockles of my analytical heart." The remainder of the journey passed in speculation. Holmes grew more animated as we approached the coast, pacing the narrow aisle of the carriage and sketching diagrams upon his cuff with a pencil stub. By the time we alighted at Eastbourne Station, he had already formed several theories, each discarded as quickly as it arose. The sea air met us with a sharp salt sting, and the sound of the waves carried faintly over the cliffs. Inspector Lestrade awaited us upon the platform, his small figure wrapped in a heavy overcoat, and his expression betraying both relief and frustration. "Glad you could come down, Mr. Holmes," said he, shaking hands. "It's a rum business, this one. I've seen my share of queer crimes, but I'll be hanged if I can make head or tail of this." "Then it promises to be of the first interest," Holmes replied with a thin smile. "Let us lose no time, Inspector. The sea has a way of washing evidence clean, and I prefer to arrive before the tide of local opinion submerges. The truth altogether, a short drive brought us to the cliffs overlooking Beachy Head. The lighthouse stood upon a rocky promontory some distance below, a solitary white tower rising from the spray, its glass lantern glinting in the pale afternoon light. The descent to it was steep and treacherous, a narrow path winding among the cliffs before reaching the causeway that connected it to the mainland at low tide. As we picked our way down, Holmes paused once or twice to examine the ground, his gaze darting over the path with the precision of a hawk searching for prey. "Observe, Watson," said he, pointing to a patch of clay. "Two sets of prints, one light and regular, belonging, I should think, to a man of average height wearing rubber-soled boots. The other heavier, with a broader tread. They ascend together, but only one returns. Remarkable." Lestrade bent low. "I saw those as well, Mr. Holmes, thought little of them. Could be the assistant keeper and one of the local fishermen." "Possibly," Holmes murmured, "but note the spacing. The lighter prints overlap the heavier at intervals, as though the man were hurrying to keep pace with a slower companion. Such small irregularities are often the hinges upon which truth turns." The wind grew fiercer as we reached the base of the tower. Within, the circular chamber smelled of salt and lamp oil, its whitewashed walls gleaming in the lamplight. A young constable saluted Lestrade as we entered and led us up the iron spiral stair to the lamp room. It was there that the tragedy had occurred. The chamber, encased in thick glass, looked out over the churning sea. Upon the floor lay a dark stain, half scrubbed away, and beside it the outline of a man's body had been chalked. A massive lens dominated the room, its facets catching the light like a giant diamond. Holmes stood quite still, his eyes taking in every detail, the bolts upon the door, the window latches, the narrow ledge outside. Then, without a word, he crossed to the great lens and examined its metal frame, running his fingers lightly along the edge. He crouched, peering beneath the machinery, then rose abruptly. "Lestrade," said he, "this key you mentioned, where is it?" The inspector produced it from his pocket. Holmes took it, inspected its worn teeth, and fitted it into the lock. It turned smoothly. "A simple mechanism," he murmured. "Yet the key was in the dead man's pocket, you say? Interesting. Most interesting. Watson," he added, straightening suddenly, "note the soot upon the inner handle, and the faint impression of a gloved thumb." Our murderer was cautious, perhaps too cautious. And there, by the base of the lens, do you perceive that small flake of red paint? I bent to look, seeing indeed a tiny fragment clinging to the metal rim. "A boat," Holmes said softly. "A boat freshly painted and red in color. I fancy we are beginning to see the outline of our artist's work." Lestrade looked incredulous. "A boat, Holmes?" But the door was locked, the windows bolted, and no vessel was near enough for landing. "Precisely," Holmes replied, his eyes gleaming. "And yet our murderer departed as silently as the tide itself. Come, Watson, we must speak with this Mr. Penrose at once. I would learn what manner of man serves as the keeper of a lighthouse, and what secrets a light may hide when it shines too long upon human darkness." The wind howled about the tower as we descended, the sea surging below like a living thing. I could not tell whether the chill that gripped me came from the cold air or from the mystery that seemed to deepen with every passing moment. Holmes walked ahead, his tall figure bent against the gale. And I knew that the game had begun in earnest. The assistant keeper, George Penrose, awaited us in the small living quarters at the base of the lighthouse. He was a wiry man of perhaps 40, his face browned by wind and sea, his eyes restless and wary. The room itself bore that peculiar air of isolation one associates with life lived on the edge of civilization. An oil lamp upon a narrow table, a few books in a weathered shelf, a kettle upon a small iron stove, and through the single window the grey sea heaving endlessly beyond. Penrose rose as we entered, his cap clutched in his hands. "You'll be Mr. Holmes, sir," he said, his voice roughened by the salt air. "Inspector Lestrade told me you were coming. I hope you can make sense of this business, for it's turned my stomach and set all Eastbourne talking." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "We shall endeavour to, Mr. Penrose. Pray sit. I should be obliged if you would recount for us the events of the night in question, as plainly as you can recall them. Every detail, however small, may prove essential." Penrose nodded, drawing a slow breath. "It was the evening tide, sir, about 10:30 by my watch. The storm was blowing fierce, so Mr. Graves and I had lit the lamp early. He was in the lamp chamber, polishing the lens as he often did before turning in. I'd just gone below to make some tea when I heard a heavy thud above, like something falling. I called up but got no answer. I went up to the landing and found the door locked. That wasn't unusual. Mr. Graves always kept it so when working, but when he didn't reply a second time I began to feel uneasy. I knocked hard, and when there was still no answer, I went round to the outside ladder, thinking perhaps he'd stepped out to check the glass panels. But the shutters were closed, sir, tight shut, and the window bolts were fastened from inside. I came back down, fetched a hammer, and forced the door." He paused, his hands twisting the cap between them. He was lying there by the lamp, his head bleeding something awful. I sent the signal lamp to shore for help, though by the time the men arrived, it was near 2 in the morning. No one could understand how it had happened. The door was bolted, the key in his pocket, and there wasn't a sign of another soul about. Holmes listened intently, his fingers steepled before him. "You say you heard a heavy thud. Was there any sound before it? A voice, a footstep, anything of that nature?" "No, sir. Just the wind and the sea. There's always noise here, so you learn not to notice most of it." "And Mr. Graves, what manner of man was he?" Penrose hesitated. "Quiet, sir. Proper in his work, but close about his affairs. Didn't mix much with the townsfolk. They said he'd once been in the Navy, but he never spoke of it. Kept to himself, mostly. He'd been uneasy these last few weeks. Kept glancing out to sea at night as though expecting something. Holmes's eyes sharpened. Expecting someone, perhaps? Penrose looked uncertain. Couldn't say, sir. But 3 nights before he died, he sent a message ashore by one of the fishermen. Said it was for the post, but I never saw him write it. And there was a stranger about. Man in a dark coat, seen twice near the cliffs. The villagers thought he might be from the Admiralty, but he never came down to the lighthouse itself. Holmes exchanged a brief glance with Lestrade. A stranger upon the cliffs, a secret letter, and a man with a naval past. I think, Watson, we are beginning to see the outline of motive, though the form remains indistinct. He rose, pacing the small room with quick, silent steps. Mr. Penrose, did Mr. Graves keep any personal papers, letters, a diary, anything of the kind? There's his desk in the next room, Penrose replied, pointing toward a narrow doorway. I've not touched it since the police came. Holmes passed through, Lestrade and I following. The desk was small and plain, its drawers neatly ordered. Holmes examined the contents rapidly but with precision. There were charts of coastal currents, records of the lamp's maintenance, and a few letters, mostly of official nature. Then, from beneath a sheaf of documents, Holmes drew out a folded piece of parchment. He unfolded it carefully, revealing a hand-drawn map of the English Channel, marked with faint pencil lines and a series of notations near the Sussex coast. "Ah," Holmes murmured, "and what have we here?" Lestrade peered over his shoulder. "Just a sea chart by the look of it." Holmes smiled faintly. "You see, but you do not observe, Inspector. Note these marks. These are not navigational corrections. They indicate intervals of time and distance, measurements perhaps of something moving along the coast. And here, this faint circle near Beachy Head, Tina written beside it. Curious. Mr. Graves was measuring something or someone who came by water." He turned to Penrose. "Tell me, were any boats seen offshore on the night of the murder?" Penrose shook his head. "None that I know of, sir. But the fog was thick. You couldn't see 10 yards ahead." Holmes replaced the map carefully in his pocket. Fog isolation, secrecy, all elements most congenial to a crime conceived with foresight. Yet the locked door remains. A most impertinent obstacle. He crossed to the small window overlooking the sea and studied it silently. The sun had begun to sink, the waves flashing red beneath the glow. For a moment he stood so motionless, then turned to Lestrade. "You will remain here tonight, I presume?" "I've taken a room in Eastbourne," said the inspector. "The tide cuts this place off after dark." Holmes nodded slowly. "Quite so. Then Watson and I shall stay within the lighthouse. There are answers here that only the night may yield." Lestrade looked startled. "You mean to spend the night in this cursed tower?" Holmes' lips curved faintly. "If one would catch a shadow, Inspector, one must sometimes stand where the light cannot reach." By the time Lestrade departed, the tide had risen, severing the narrow causeway and leaving the lighthouse surrounded by restless water. Penrose retired early, and Holmes and I ascended once more to the lamp chamber. The wind screamed about the glass, and the great lens revolved slowly, throwing its beam far across the dark sea. The rhythmic sweep of light and shadow gave the room an eerie stillness, as though time itself turned with the mechanism. Holmes had brought with him his magnifying lens and a small metal tool, with which he examined the bolts and hinges of the door. "Observe, Watson," he said quietly, "the scratches about the keyhole, recent though not made by a knife or pick, rather by a thin, flexible wire. The murderer had access to such a tool, entered unseen and then withdrew it before the door was found. But how? That is the difficulty." He straightened and moved to the lens. The red paint flake still clung where we had found it. Holmes took it up delicately with tweezers and placed it within a small envelope. "Tomorrow we shall find the boat to which this belongs. Tonight, however, I am curious to see whether our visitor will return." We waited. The hours passed, the lamp's glow sweeping endlessly over the sea. The air grew thick with mist, and now and then the distant moan of a buoy drifted through the wind. Holmes sat silent, his eyes fixed upon the door. Near midnight he stirred. "Do you hear it, Watson?" I held my breath. Faintly, beneath the roar of the surf, came the unmistakable creak of oars. Holmes's eyes glinted. "Our artist returns to finish his composition. Remain still. Speak no word." He moved like a shadow to the window and peered out into the dark. I followed his gaze and thought I saw far below a faint glimmer of red moving upon the waves. Then Holmes turned to me, his expression unreadable. "The sea conceals many things, Watson," he whispered. "But tonight, I fancy, it will give up one of its secrets." The faint rhythm of the oars grew clearer, blending with the sea's steady surge, until the two sounds became one slow, measured pulse against the rocks. Holmes remained motionless, his lean figure outlined by the dim glow of the revolving lamp. The pale light struck his features at intervals, revealing the tension of every line, the concentration of a man whose entire being was fixed upon the unraveling of a single thread. At length he turned to me. "Watson," he whispered, "take this lantern, but keep it shuttered. When I give the signal, open it fully and direct the beam toward the causeway. We must see who ventures to approach." I obeyed in silence. Holmes moved swiftly down the iron stair, his steps as soundless as the fall of dust. I followed close behind, the lantern pressed to my chest. The tower groaned faintly in the wind, each step echoing like a whisper of warning through the hollow shaft. When we reached the lower landing, Holmes paused by the heavy door leading to the outer platform. The booming of the surf was nearer now, and through the narrow slit of the shutter, we saw a pale glimmer moving upon the tide. Holmes raised a finger. "Now, Watson." I threw open the lantern's shutter. The sudden flash of light cut through the mist and struck the water. For an instant we saw it clearly, a small boat painted a vivid crimson, its hull glistening wetly under the beam. A single man sat within, his face obscured by the brim of a wide oilskin hat. At the burst of light he started, seized the oars and turned the boat sharply away from the causeway. "Quickly!" Holmes exclaimed, wrenching open the door. The sea air rushed in, carrying with it the salt sting of spray. "We must reach the path before he rounds the rocks." We dashed across the platform, our boots clanging against the iron grating, and descended the narrow steps leading toward the base. The wind tore at our coats, and I could scarcely hear Holmes above the roar of the surf. Yet he moved with astonishing speed, his long limbs carrying him down the treacherous slope as though he had been born to it. By the time we reached the water's edge, the boat had vanished into the fog. Holmes stood motionless, his eyes sweeping the darkness. The beam from the lighthouse swung slowly overhead, illuminating for an instant the white foam upon the waves and the jagged outline of the cliffs beyond. "He cannot have gone far," I gasped. "Shall we rouse the Coast Guard?" "No," Holmes replied quietly. "We shall learn nothing by pursuit. The tide and the fog would make fools of us both. But he has revealed himself, and that is more than I dared hope. He will not risk returning again tonight." He turned toward the path. "Come, Watson. There is still much to be read before the dawn." Back within the tower, Holmes resumed his silent pacing, his brow furrowed in deep thought. The red boat, the vanished stranger, the locked room, all these fragments turned in his mind like pieces of a mosaic seeking their proper place. I seated myself near the stove, for the damp chill had begun to creep into my bones, and watched him with growing curiosity. After some minutes, he halted abruptly. "Watson, the man in the boat, what struck you most about him?" I considered. His haste, perhaps, and that he turned away the moment we exposed him. Holmes nodded slowly. "True, but incomplete. He wore an oilskin hat, practical for sea work, but unnecessary on a calm night unless one wished to conceal the face. Moreover, the boat was new, its paint still fresh. He is no common fisherman. A local would have known the risks of landing here in such conditions. No, this is a man of purpose accustomed to secrecy, and that purpose must be bound to Graves's death." He drew the small envelope from his pocket and tapped it lightly. "The flake of paint, proof enough that this same craft was here before. It seems our visitor has returned to recover something he left behind." "But what?" He turned to the narrow writing table where the sea chart had been found and began to lay out several of the papers from Graves's desk. "Watson, do you recall the mark Tween beside Beachy Head? I believe it signifies not a time but a date. The 12th. That is 2 nights hence. Graves expected some event or meeting then. His death has merely advanced another man's schedule. Then you think," I said slowly, "that this murder was intended to prevent him from speaking, or perhaps from revealing what he knew?" "Exactly so. The question becomes, what did Graves know, and to whom was he sending his secret letter?" Holmes' voice dropped to a murmur. "I suspect this map concerns more than simple tides. It may record the movements of a vessel, one whose presence was not meant to be known. He turned the chart toward the lamp, the faint pencil lines gleaming under the glow. These measurements are taken from a fixed vantage, the lighthouse itself. Graves was tracking something that passed regularly under cover of darkness. A smuggler's craft, perhaps, or something of greater consequence. I watched as he traced the route with his long, pale fingers. "See here, Watson, these coordinates run eastward toward the channel. And this notation, north by 2 degrees, would place the object directly in the path of a known naval testing area. Graves, the ex-seaman, may have stumbled upon something far larger than contraband." Before I could reply, a faint knock sounded below. Holmes raised a hand for silence. The knock came again, louder this time, a dull thudding against the outer door. "Penrose, perhaps," I whispered. Holmes shook his head. "Penrose sleeps below." That sound came from the causeway entrance, not the inner stair. "Someone is outside." We moved cautiously down the steps, the lantern dimmed once more. The knocking had ceased, replaced by a faint scraping noise as though something metallic dragged across the door. Holmes motioned for me to stand back, then in one swift movement threw open the shutter. The beam spilled out upon the platform, and there, caught in its light, lay a folded scrap of paper pinned beneath a knife. Holmes retrieved it with care, the wind tearing at his sleeves as he leaned into the gale. He examined the knife briefly, then unfolded the note. The writing, scrawled hastily in pencil, was uneven but legible. "Keep from the 12th, or the sea will take you both. The light is not for you." Holmes read it twice, then handed it to me. "A warning, Watson. How considerate of our adversary." He smiled, though the expression was thin and cold. "A man who threatens prefers not to act yet. He fears discovery, which means he still has something to protect. The question is whether the 12th marks an ending or a beginning." He closed the lantern and stepped back inside. "We shall have visitors again soon, but not before the next tide. Until then we must prepare." As dawn crept over the grey horizon, painting the sea in shades of pewter and pale gold, Holmes stood by the window, the note in his hand. "Watson," he said softly, "there are 3 men upon whom this mystery now turns. The dead keeper, the silent assistant, and the sailor who rose by night. Between them lies a truth that touches the very heart of England's coast. Before the 12th we must know what light Mr. Graves truly guarded, and why it was worth a man's life." He turned then, his eyes gleaming with that strange inner fire I knew so well. "Come, my dear fellow, sleep if you can, for tomorrow we begin to fish the channel for facts." And as the first ray of sunlight broke through the mist and struck the great revolving lens above us, I felt rather than saw the shadow that still lingered within that tower, a darkness deeper than the sea itself, and one that even the light of day could not yet dispel. I awoke to the rhythmic groan of the sea and the steady creak of the tower. The grey light of morning had crept through the narrow windows, diffusing a ghostly pallor over the small chamber, where Holmes sat already at work, a cup of untouched coffee cooling beside him. His violin lay across his knees, not in play but as though he had forgotten its presence entirely. The faint sharp scent of sea air mingled with the lingering smoke from his pipe. "You slept soundly, my dear Watson," he remarked without looking up. "An enviable talent when one's quarters stand between the wind and eternity." "I confess the storm, and your watchfulness kept me uneasy for a time," I replied, rubbing my eyes. "But exhaustion triumphed at last. Have you been awake all night?" "Nearly. I have found the silence of this place curiously instructive. The sea has a rhythm, Watson, a rhythm that matches the pulse of the case itself, rising, receding, and returning again with fresh energy. It tells me our man will act soon, for the tide of his fear is turning." He rose then, his tall form seeming almost spectral in the dim light. "Come, Penrose stirs below, and I fancy he has something on his conscience." We descended the spiral stair, our steps echoing faintly in the hollow shaft. Penrose sat at the table, nursing a mug of tea, his face drawn and pale. He started when we entered, then lowered his eyes to the cup. "Mr. Penrose," Holmes said gently, "you slept well, I trust?" "As well as a man might with the sea roaring in his ears and a ghost on his mind," the keeper muttered. "I heard something in the night, sir. Footsteps above. Thought it was you, perhaps, until I saw your light down below through the hatch." Holmes exchanged a quick glance with me. "You are certain it was not the wind?" Penrose shook his head. "No wind ever walked a floorboard, sir. Someone moved about in the lamp room after you'd gone up." Holmes's eyes gleamed. Then we have confirmation. Our visitor returned, not by boat this time, but by a path unseen. He began pacing the small chamber, his mind clearly racing. Watson, the lighthouse is isolated save for the causeway, yet there must be another means of approach, a service ladder, a crevice in the cliff, something known only to those who work here. Penrose, is there any such entrance? The keeper hesitated, rubbing his hands together. There's the ventilation shaft, sir. Runs from the machinery room below the base up to the level of the rocks. Narrow and steep, but a man could climb it with care. I never gave it thought, as it's near impossible to reach from outside unless one knows where to look. Near impossible, Holmes repeated softly, but not entirely. He stopped pacing and turned sharply to face Penrose. Tell me truthfully, did Graves ever speak of anyone having used that shaft, or of any mischief near it? Penrose's face reddened slightly. Once, sir, about a fortnight ago, he found the grate loose, thought it the work of rust. I fixed it myself. Holmes's expression grew intent. Rust does not unscrew bolts, my good fellow. I think we have found our murderer's door. He ordered a lantern and the key to the machinery room, and within moments we stood at the base of the tower, where the air was damp and heavy with oil. The sound of the waves echoed through the iron foundation, a low, continuous growl. Holmes crouched beside the narrow vent shaft, its iron bars dark with age and salt. He touched one lightly, and it shifted beneath his hand. Loose indeed, he murmured. See how the bolts have been turned with care, not broken or pried. The man who removed this knew his tools and his time. He ascended here unseen while Graves was above tending the lamp. He rose, brushing the dust from his coat. Watson, imagine the sequence. The killer lands his boat under cover of fog, here where the rocks afford concealment. He climbs the shaft, finds Graves alone, and strikes him down. He then escapes the same way, the key left upon the dead man to seal the illusion of a locked room. But one detail escaped him, the trace of his craft upon the lens left by the tide's moisture and the red paint we found. Artistry marred by haste. It fits perfectly, I said, struck by the clarity of it. But what of the note? And the warning about the 12th? Ah, Holmes replied, his tone thoughtful. The note speaks of fear, not triumph. Our man acts under orders or under threat. The 12th is no arbitrary date. It is the hour of a rendezvous, the same event Graves was tracking. Whoever controls that meeting fears discovery, hence this elaborate crime. We are dealing, I suspect, not with a solitary murderer, but with a design, one involving the sea itself. He straightened suddenly and turned to Penrose. Mr. Penrose, when the fog lifts, I must see every boat moored within 5 miles of this coast. You will aid Lestrade in that. Have no word of what we found here. Let our quarry think us blind. Penrose nodded mutely, and Holmes motioned for us to ascend once more. As we climbed, he grew silent, save for the soft rasp of his hand along the iron rail. At last he said, almost to himself, "It is an elegant puzzle, Watson. The locked chamber, the vanishing boat, the warning, all threads of one tapestry. And yet the central image eludes me. What was Graves watching from this tower? What light did he guard that others would kill to extinguish?" The rest of the morning passed in a tense quiet. Holmes spent hours upon the balcony, scanning the horizon through his glass. Around noon, Lestrade returned, his face ruddy from the sea wind. "Mr. Holmes, we found the boat," he announced, red as your clue said it would be. "Hauled it up near Pevensey under an old tarpaulin. No name, no marks, but the oars were damp, used within the last night." Holmes's eyes lit with quick satisfaction. "Excellent, Lestrade. And what of its owner? Local fisherman claims he sold it 3 weeks ago to a stranger. Paid in gold sovereigns, no name given. Said he was to use it for private night work, soundings or such." "Soundings," Holmes repeated, a convenient word for many sins. "You have the boat guarded?" "Under watch, yes," Holmes nodded. "Keep it so. If I am right, the owner will attempt to reclaim it before the 12th. As the day waned, the sky deepened to a pewter hue, and the waves took on a dull silver sheen. Holmes stood again at the window, gazing out to the horizon where the sun had dropped behind the haze. The note lay open on the table beside the chart, its words dark against the paper. "Watson," he said quietly, "do you recall the last line? 'The light is not for you'? I think I begin to understand. There is a ship that passes this headland each month at the same tide. Graves recorded its movement, but not its name. The killer's purpose was not to silence him for curiosity's sake, but to protect the secrecy of that voyage. Whatever sails on the 12th carries something or someone England was not meant to see. He turned to me, his eyes shining with that fierce clarity I had witnessed in only a few of our greatest cases. We must be upon the cliffs when that ship passes. And, my dear Watson, if I mistake not, the key to this entire affair lies not within the lighthouse, but upon the dark waters that surround it. Outside, the tide roared louder, and the beam from the lamp swept over the sea like a searching eye. Somewhere beneath that restless surface, I felt the truth moving closer, slow, inevitable, and perilous as the tide itself. The wind rose steadily through the evening, carrying with it the salt tang of the sea and the ceaseless roar of the surf below. Holmes stood by the narrow window, his silhouette sharp against the faint glow of the horizon. The air was thick with anticipation. Something unseen and weighty pressed upon that lonely tower, as though the sea itself conspired to hide its secrets. "Watson," he murmured, "we are at the edge of discovery. The difficulty is no longer in perceiving the truth, but in proving it." He turned from the window, his eyes alight with the strange, almost feverish energy that always came to him before revelation. "You recall the fisherman's tale of the stranger who bought the red boat?" "Perfectly. I took the liberty, before our arrival, of telegraphing to Mycroft concerning certain foreign movements off our southern coasts. His reply arrived this morning, though it reached me only now through the Coast Guard's dispatch rider. Here, see for yourself." He handed me a folded slip of paper, the familiar neat handwriting of Holmes's elder brother crossing it. The message read, "Foreign vessel sighted monthly beyond Seaford Head. Suspected to signal from shore at midnight tide. Cargo unknown. Avoid interference until certain of connection. Intelligence priority." I looked up. Then Graves's death was an act of concealment, Watson. Graves had stumbled upon their signal. The light of this very tower was being used as a code. 3 short flashes, 1 long, then darkness. He recorded the pattern, doubtless intending to report it. Our murderer struck before he could do so. The logic unfolded with the crisp precision I had come to expect from Holmes, yet one detail troubled me. But who could orchestrate such a thing? Surely not Penrose. He seems as startled as we. Holmes smiled faintly. Startled, yes, but fear and guilt wear similar masks. I do not accuse him yet, though he is either the tool or the unwitting accomplice. No, there is another hand, one hidden beneath layers of obedience. "The key lies in the 12th. A knock sounded below, followed by Lestrade's voice echoing up the stairwell. "Holmes, you'd best come down. The tide's turning fast, and we've found something washed ashore." Holmes seized his coat and was halfway down before I could follow. The wind buffeted us as we emerged onto the narrow path at the base of the cliff. There, among the rocks half covered by foam, lay a man's coat, heavy oil-slick and torn at one sleeve. Lestrade crouched beside it, holding up a small brass cylinder. "Found this in the pocket," he said grimly. "Looks like a signal flare." Holmes took it carefully, turning it in the light of his lantern. "A maritime flare, German make. See the markings here? Manufactured in Bremen. Curious, is it not, that such an object should drift ashore within a mile of where a foreign vessel is rumoured to signal under cover of darkness?" "You mean this is part of some smuggling?" Lestrade asked, frowning. "Smuggling, espionage, perhaps both. But note this. No ordinary fisherman would carry a flare of this caliber. Its burn intensity is meant to be seen from miles at sea. A single flash at the right moment could be mistaken for part of the lighthouse beam itself." He rose abruptly. "Come, Watson. The machinery room, quickly." We followed him back through the storm, the wind howling against the iron walls. Once inside, Holmes struck a match and examined the shaft where the grate had been loosened. "Look here," he said. "Sand along the inner edge, fine, white and dry. Not the sand of this shore, which is coarse and dark. Our man climbed up again last night after we slept, but from a landing further east. That accounts for the new prints by the rocks Penrose dismissed as gull tracks." He replaced the grate with careful precision. "We must let him believe his secret remains intact. If my calculations are correct, he will return tomorrow night to complete his work, on the 12th tide." As he spoke, the storm broke in earnest, the tower shuddering under the force of the wind. The lamp above flickered, then steadied again. Holmes paced the narrow floor like a man consumed by the rhythm of his thoughts. "There is still one question, Watson, the identity of the signaller within the tower. Graves was silenced, but someone must now carry on his role or the ship offshore will lose its contact. I am tempted to think Penrose, though unwillingly, has been drawn into this web. He alone tends the light and would be missed if it failed to shine." He paused, the faint smile returning to his lips. "Yet if that is so, the next signal will not go unanswered, and I intend to be the one to answer it." The rest of that day passed in tense preparation. Holmes instructed Lestrade to post 2 constables a mile inland, concealed from the cliff's view. "Should you see a light flash thrice and once more long, advance at once," he said. "No premature move. The success of this depends upon timing." As dusk deepened, the clouds broke apart, revealing a clear, moonlit sky. The sea, restless and silver-edged, stretched like glass beneath the horizon. Holmes and I waited within the lamproom, every sound magnified by the stillness. Penrose had retired below, or so he claimed, though Holmes kept a sharp ear for the creak of footsteps. Hours passed. Then, just as the clock struck 11, Holmes stiffened. "There, did you see it?" Far out upon the water, a faint red spark gleamed, vanished, then reappeared twice more in rapid succession. Holmes adjusted the lamp shutter and, with deliberate precision, mimicked the same pattern. 3 short beams, 1 long. We waited. The sea seemed to hold its breath. Then, from the distance, the faint glow of another light pulsed in answer. Holmes's voice was low, urgent. "The exchange is established. They believe their contact lives still. Now, Watson, we shall see who among us betrays himself." Softly, ever so faintly, footsteps sounded below, the unmistakable rhythm of cautious ascent. Holmes motioned me to silence and extinguished the lantern. The beam from the lamp cast eerie shifting shadows through the glass, painting the stairwell in streaks of gold and shadow. The steps halted just below the landing. A hand appeared on the rail, strong, gloved, trembling slightly, and then a figure emerged. It was Penrose, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror rather than malice. He froze when he saw Holmes standing there, unmoving as stone. "Mr. Penrose," Holmes said quietly, "you need not fear. You have been used. Speak the truth, and perhaps your conscience may yet find peace." The man's voice broke. "I swear it, sir. I never meant harm. They said it was only a signal for the mail ships, just a harmless flash now and again. But then Graves found out, and when he threatened to go to the police, he buried his face in his hands. They said they'd kill me if I refused." Holmes's tone softened, but his eyes remained keen. "And who are they, Penrose? Who gave you the order?" Before Penrose could answer, a thunderous crack split the air, the sound of a firearm from somewhere below. Penrose staggered, clutching his shoulder, and Holmes sprang forward to catch him before he fell. "Watson, the shooter's at the base. Stay with him!" Holmes cried, darting toward the stairs. The sound of retreating footsteps echoed down the shaft, quick and desperate. I pressed my hand against Penrose's wound, clean through the flesh but not mortal. His lips moved faintly. It was the man with the red boat. Then his eyes rolled back as consciousness left him. Above us the light continued to turn, casting its beam out across the dark sea, where for one brief instant I thought I saw the shadow of a ship slipping silently into the mist. Holmes was gone into the storm after it, his figure swallowed by the night, and I felt the chill of dread settle upon me. The 12th tide had come, and with it the true heart of the mystery. The echo of Holmes's boots on the iron stairs faded into the howling wind, leaving only the rhythmic pulse of the lantern above and the labored breathing of the wounded man in my arms. The storm had risen again, fierce and unrelenting, battering the lighthouse walls with a fury that seemed almost alive. I pressed my handkerchief firmly against Penrose's shoulder, feeling the warm blood seeping through, and tried to calm him. "Steady now, my good fellow," I murmured. "You're not badly hurt, but you must hold still. Holmes will see to this." Penrose's eyes fluttered open briefly, glazed with pain and terror. "He's out there. He'll not come back alive. The sea takes its own." His words dissolved into a moan as the thunder cracked overhead. I dared not leave him, though every instinct urged me to follow Holmes into the tempest. The thought of my friend alone on the treacherous cliff path, pursuing an armed man through the storm, filled me with a dread I could scarcely contain. Still, I knew his purpose. Holmes was not one to chase blindly. He would have already seen the trail, the direction of the shot, perhaps even anticipated it. Minutes passed, perhaps more, for time in that gale lost all meaning, before a flash of light outside caught my eye. It was not lightning, but the beam of a lantern swinging erratically as if in haste. Footsteps soon followed and the door burst open. Lestrade stumbled in, soaked to the bone, his hat gone, his face pale but fierce. "Watson, where's Holmes?" He shouted over the roar of the wind. "He went after the shooter, the man who struck Penrose." Lestrade cursed under his breath and knelt beside me. We heard the shot from below, but the wind near carried the sound away. "There's movement on the rocks. Someone's making for the east inlet." "That will be Holmes," I said grimly, "or his quarry." "Likely both," Lestrade muttered, rising. "Keep him alive, Doctor." "Held—" Before he could finish, another figure appeared in the doorway, a seaman, drenched and wild-eyed, clutching his side. "Help! For the Lord's sake, help!" he gasped, collapsing against the threshold. Lestrade caught him before he hit the floor. "Who are you, man?" "Speak, Jory." "Jory Pike, from the Cutter Havon," the man rasped. "We was anchored by the headland when we saw the flash. Red light from the cliffs. Then a boat come out of the mist. No name, just black hull. Fired on us without warning. 2 of my mates gone." Holmes's theory came rushing back to me. The red boat, the foreign vessel, the signal from the tower. It was unfolding exactly as he'd predicted, only now with deadly force. Lestrade and I exchanged a grim look. "It's begun," he muttered. "Stay with Penrose," I said, rising. "If Holmes is on those cliffs, he'll need support." "I'm going after him." Lestrade hesitated only a second before nodding. "Take my revolver. You'll need it." I pocketed the weapon and stepped into the storm. The wind struck me like a wall, cold and relentless. Rain whipped my face as I fought my way down the path toward the eastern rocks. Every flash of lightning revealed the jagged outlines of the cliffs and the frothing sea below. Somewhere ahead I heard a faint cry, sharp, commanding Holmes's voice. I pushed forward, heart pounding. The beam from the lighthouse swung in slow, rhythmic arcs, illuminating the rocks in brief, ghostly glimpses. Then suddenly a movement, a dark figure scrambling across the wet stone, followed by another, swift and sure-footed. "Holmes!" I shouted, but my voice was lost in the gale. The nearest flash of lightning revealed the scene in stark clarity. Holmes had cornered his quarry near the edge of the precipice. The man turned, his pistol raised, and the report of a shot rang out, followed by a spray of shattered stone. Holmes moved like quicksilver, ducking, lunging forward, and with a deft motion striking the weapon from the man's grasp. They grappled dangerously close to the cliff's edge, the surf crashing below like cannon fire. I stumbled toward them, but before I could reach, the man broke free and fled down a narrow fissure, leading toward the inlet. Holmes turned sharply. "Watson, this way. He's heading for the boat." We descended the rocks together, half sliding, half leaping, until the path opened onto a small cove. There, rocking violently against the tide, was a small craft, red-painted, its paint now peeling and slick with seaweed. The fugitive scrambled aboard, fumbling to cut the line, when Holmes sprang onto the stern and seized him by the collar. The man twisted, a knife flashing in his hand, but Holmes struck his wrist, sending the blade clattering into the sea. I reached them moments later, breathless, and together we hauled the assailant ashore. He fought fiercely like a trapped animal until the beam from the lighthouse swept over his face, and I saw him clearly for the first time. He was no sailor but a gentleman, his features refined though hardened by exposure. His hair was cropped short, his eyes cold and calculating. A foreign accent colored his words as he spat, "You meddle in affairs beyond your island, Mr. Holmes." Holmes regarded him with icy calm. "Indeed? Then it would seem England's shores have grown smaller than I thought. Who commands you?" The man gave a bitter smile. "You think I would speak? My silence is worth more than my life." Holmes studied him for a long moment, then turned to me. "Watson, note the coat insignia, naval but not of our own fleet. I believe our suspicions are well-founded." The man's composure faltered at that, though he said nothing. We bound his hands with a length of rope from the boat and began the slow ascent back toward the tower. The storm began to abate, leaving behind a heavy mist that clung to the rocks like smoke. By the time we reached the lighthouse, dawn had begun to pale the sky. Lestrade met us at the door, his relief evident. "Thank heaven, Holmes. We heard the shots but couldn't reach you through the gale. Our friend here," Holmes said, giving the prisoner a firm shove forward, "has been kind enough to provide us with the missing piece. You will find, Lestrade, that his pockets contain a coded signal key, and if I'm not mistaken, a dispatch meant for the ship offshore." Lestrade's eyes widened. "Then this was espionage, not mere smuggling." precisely. Graves died because he deciphered the pattern. 3 short flashes, 1 long, the signal that marked the landing of a spy vessel. The 12th was their appointed date to retrieve new intelligence from the coast. When Graves interfered, they silenced him. Holmes looked toward the sea where the mist still hung low. But they did not account for us. Penrose, pale but conscious now, sat by the hearth as we entered. He looked at the captured man with a mixture of fear and relief. "That's him, the one who brought the letters. Said they were for inspection. He made me flash the light." Holmes inclined his head. "You have done your duty now, Mr. Penrose. I shall ensure Scotland Yard is lenient." He moved to the window, watching as the dawn broke across the horizon. The red hue of the rising sun mingled with the fading beam of the lighthouse, casting the room in a strange half-light. "It is curious," Holmes murmured, almost to himself. A tower built to warn ships from peril became itself the instrument of treachery. The murderer sought to cloak his crime beneath the light of duty, and yet, as ever, truth revealed itself by that very light. He turned to me with a weary smile. "Watson, I think we may now call this matter concluded, though I suspect Mycroft will have much to say about the finer politics of it." And as the wind softened and the waves receded into their ceaseless rhythm, the great lamp of the lighthouse continued to turn, no longer a signal of deceit, but once more a beacon of honest warning to the sea. Yet even then, as Holmes stood gazing outward, I knew his thoughts were already elsewhere, upon the next riddle waiting to be untangled from the world's shadows. The morning light that followed was a pale, uncertain thing, washing over the cliffs with a muted glow that seemed to carry the exhaustion of the night storm. The air smelled of salt and smoke, and the sea, now subdued, rolled in heavy, measured waves. Holmes stood at the threshold of the lighthouse, his coat drawn tight against the chill, gazing toward the horizon where a grey silhouette still lingered far out to sea. It was the foreign vessel, motionless for now, like a vulture waiting on the wind. "Lestrade," Holmes said quietly, "have your men signal the Coast Guard. No attempt must be made to approach that ship until further orders. If we move too soon, we risk alerting the rest of their network." Lestrade nodded, fatigue etched deep into his features. "You think there are more of them ashore?" Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. "I think, my dear Lestrade, that a single man could not have operated such a scheme alone. There are accomplices yet undiscovered, perhaps even among those who came to aid this investigation. You may recall the tide of deception rarely ends with the first wave." He turned back toward the interior, where our prisoner sat bound to a chair, his face impassive, but his eyes darting ceaselessly from one of us to another. Penrose, pale and trembling, hovered near the far wall, refusing to meet the man's gaze. Holmes approached the prisoner and placed a single sheet of paper on the table before him. "You are a long way from Bremen," he said softly. "Your vessel waits for orders that will not come. And your companion on shore, the one who fired upon Penrose, is either dead or lost among the rocks. I suggest you speak now before the sea claims him entirely and leaves you alone to bear the charge." The man's lip curled faintly. "You overestimate your reach, Mr. Holmes. England may be an island, but its waters are not yours alone." Holmes's tone sharpened. "Perhaps not. Yet the law extends further than your arrogance imagines. Tell me, what message was Graves meant to intercept? What cargo waits beyond the fog?" For a long moment, there was silence save for the rhythmic groan of the sea below. Then the man gave a low, bitter laugh. "You think this is about a message? It is about power. The light of this tower reaches 30 miles, yes? Imagine then what could be sent across the channel under the guise of a beacon. A code invisible to all but those who know its language. Graves saw too much. That was his crime." Holmes leaned closer, his eyes intent. "And yours?" "My duty," the man replied coldly. "One that will outlast even your cleverness, Mr. Holmes." Before Holmes could respond, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed up the stairway. Lestrade's sergeant burst in, breathless and drenched. "Sir!" "A body's been found, washed in by the tide not 50 yards from the cove." Holmes straightened instantly. "Describe him." "Tall fellow, foreign-looking, coat torn, a bullet wound in the chest. Must be the one who fired on the lighthouse." Holmes exchanged a glance with Lestrade. "Then the last loose end has been tied by the sea itself. Still, I should like to confirm it. Watson, come." We followed the sergeant down the path, the morning wind whipping at our coats. The cove lay silent now, its stones slick with brine. There, half buried among the seaweed, lay the body of a man. His features gaunt, his hands still clutching what appeared to be a small waterproof packet tied in oilskin. Holmes crouched beside the corpse, his face unreadable. "This," he murmured, "is the courier, the true agent. Our prisoner in the tower was merely the relay, the signalman of a darker game." He untied the packet and examined the contents, a folded chart marked with intricate symbols and a sheaf of papers written in cipher. "Coordinates," he said at last, "and schedules." The 12th was to mark the rendezvous for an exchange. Had we not intervened, these would have passed into foreign hands, carrying with them information that might have unbalanced our entire naval defense. Lestrade whistled softly. "Then it's bigger than we thought." "Bigger," Holmes agreed, "and still incomplete." He rose, his expression grave. "There remains the question of who in England supplied these details. The code used here is not foreign. It's Admiralty in origin. Someone within our own ranks fed them this intelligence. The implication hung heavy between us. Even the gulls circling above seemed to fall silent. Back at the lighthouse, the prisoner had grown restless, his composure beginning to fray. When Holmes entered, his tone was deceptively mild. "You've been admirably loyal," he said. "But loyalty, like all currencies, is only valuable when one's master pays his debts. Tell me, who gave you the key to the lighthouse's signal patterns? Who supplied the original plans?" The man hesitated, then sneered. "You think you can frighten me?" "No," Holmes replied softly, "but I can reason with you. You see, your companion's body has been recovered. He carried papers linking your organization to a known contact in London, a man named Dirksen, who has already been arrested." For the first time, the prisoner's mask faltered. His eyes flickered with the briefest hint of fear. "Ah," Holmes murmured. "You recognize the name. Then you also understand that silence will no longer serve you. You are already betrayed." The man's jaw clenched. "You can prove nothing." Holmes turned away, his voice low but sharp as steel. "On the contrary, my dear sir, the light itself will testify." He crossed to the great lens and adjusted the mechanism, his long fingers tracing the pattern of the shutters. "You claim the lighthouse was merely a tool for transmission. But see here, one shutter bears a faint residue of phosphorus mixed with oil. Invisible to the eye save under certain conditions. Graves discovered this when he cleaned the glass. He wiped away your signal markings, and in doing so sealed his fate." He turned back to the man whose defiance had begun to waver. "You were seen returning to the tower that night. The oil on your gloves, the same found on Graves's collar, will confirm it. You struck him, left him where he fell, and locked the door behind you, believing the tide would wash your tracks away. You miscalculated." The prisoner's composure broke then. His breath came fast, his gaze darting toward the window as though seeking escape. "You don't understand," he hissed. "I wasn't meant to kill him. It was only to frighten him, to make him keep the light burning as ordered. But he fought me, he shouted, and I—" His words faltered into silence. Holmes regarded him steadily, the faintest trace of pity softening his tone. "Murder rarely begins as intent, my good fellow. Yet once committed, it leaves its mark indelibly upon the conscience and upon the evidence." Lestrade stepped forward, grim satisfaction in his eyes. "That's all we needed." The prisoner slumped, defeated. "You'll never stop it," he muttered. "Another will take my place. The sea keeps its secrets." Holmes looked out toward the horizon, where the enemy vessel was now turning slowly away, its dark shape fading into the mist. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "but so does truth, and it has a longer memory than the sea." As the tide rolled back, carrying the remnants of the storm into the distance, Holmes remained by the window, his gaze fixed upon the expanse beyond. The morning sun broke through the clouds, casting a pale brilliance across the waves, and for a moment the great beam of the lighthouse seemed to meet it in silent accord. "It is over, Watson," he said at last. "The beacon will shine tonight, not as a signal of treachery, but as a sentinel of vigilance. Yet I wonder how many other lights burn in this world, unseen, twisted to serve darker ends." He smiled faintly, the melancholy of his reflections tempered by that ever-present gleam of intellect. "Ah, well, the sea gives us mysteries enough to fill a lifetime. For now, let us return to Baker Street, where the only fog we must face is of our own London's making. And as we left that lonely tower behind, its light sweeping across the awakening sea. I could not help but feel that even among the calm waves, some secret still stirred in the depths, waiting, as always, for Sherlock Holmes to uncover them. The days that followed our return from the windswept cliffs of Dover were curiously still. The noise of London, its endless rumble of wheels, the distant cries from the Thames, the muffled din of voices, seemed almost foreign after the hollow echo of waves against stone. Holmes, for his part, had retreated into that peculiar silence which always followed a case of great complexity. For hours he sat by the fire at Baker Street, fingers steepled, eyes half closed, the smoke of his pipe curling lazily above him. Yet I knew by that restless tapping of his foot and the sudden sharp glint in his eyes when the embers hissed that his mind was far from idle. It was on the third morning when the calm finally broke. A sharp knock came at the door, followed by the brisk entrance of Inspector Lestrade. His expression was grave, his coat still wet with the mist of early dawn. "Holmes," he said without preamble, "I'm afraid your work at the Lighthouse may not be as finished as you thought." Holmes did not rise, but one eyebrow lifted almost imperceptibly. "The sea gives back what it takes, does it not, Lestrade? Pray, what ghost has washed ashore this time?" Lestrade tossed a sealed envelope onto the table. "This arrived at Scotland Yard late last night. Addressed to you. No sender, no trace of where it came from. The handwriting, though, well, I'll let you judge for yourself." Holmes leaned forward, the faintest flicker of interest animating his face. He slit the envelope open with a paper knife and unfolded the single sheet it contained. The paper was thick and water-stained, as though it had travelled far. The ink, however, was bold and deliberate. I saw Holmes's eyes narrow as he read aloud. "The light still burns, though the keeper sleeps. When next it turns, the signal will rise again. A friend of the sea." For a moment there was only the crackle of the fire. Then Holmes rose abruptly, crossing to the map upon the wall. His hand hovered over the southern coast, tracing invisible lines. "Watson," he said, "do you recall the night of our arrival at the Lighthouse, the vessel that lingered offshore?" "Perfectly. You said it awaited orders that would never come." "Precisely. Yet such orders might still be sent from another shore under another guise. This letter is not a mere threat. It is a signal in itself." Lestrade frowned. "A signal? How do you figure that?" Holmes held the letter up to the light, rotating it slightly. "The phrase, 'when next it turns,' refers not to time but to rotation, a reference to the lighthouse's lens, and the signal will rise again. That suggests another beacon, another tower, perhaps connected to the same network. The phrase, 'a friend of the sea,' an identity meant to taunt, yes, but also to misdirect. Whoever wrote this knows the language of light." I felt a cold unease stir within me. "Then you believe the conspiracy continues?" "Without question," Holmes said sharply. "The web extends further than Dover. The captured agents were but a fragment. Someone remains at liberty, someone who intends to finish what was begun." Lestrade ran a hand through his hair. "Do you mean there's another lighthouse involved?" Holmes turned from the map, his gaze fierce and alive again. "Not just another, an inland signal disguised as one. There are telegraphic stations that use rotating lamps for coastal communication. If one of these were compromised, an entire line of defense could be subverted without a single shot fired." He moved to his desk, sweeping aside papers and opening a drawer to reveal a stack of Admiralty charts. "Here, see the pattern of illumination posts along the southern and eastern coasts. Now, if one were to mimic the Dover pattern using a secondary light at precise intervals..." Lestrade leaned over the chart. "You mean they could still send messages across the channel?" Holmes nodded grimly. "Indeed. The death of one keeper does not extinguish the flame of treachery. It merely changes the hand that tends it." He straightened suddenly, his energy renewed. "Lestrade, we must depart at once. Telegraph the coastal authorities at Hastings and Beachy Head. Tell them to maintain normal operation, but alter the rotation intervals of their lights. If the conspirators attempt to signal, we shall intercept the message instead." Within the hour we were once more on the train, the rhythmic clatter of wheels marking the tempo of Holmes's thoughts. He spoke little, though his eyes gleamed with that familiar intensity. Only once did he turn to me, his tone thoughtful. "Watson, have you ever noticed that the most dangerous men are not those who act from greed, but from conviction? Our adversary believes himself a guardian of something greater, some cause, perhaps, that justifies betrayal. That makes him all the more perilous. By dusk we had arrived at Hastings. The sky was an iron grey, the sea restless beneath a rising wind. The local constable awaited us at the station, breathless with urgency. "Mr. Holmes, sir, there's been strange goings-on at the signal hut near the cliffs. The keeper swears he's seen lights flashing from the sea these 2 nights past. Thought it was a ship in distress, but when he tried to signal back, the pattern made no sense." Holmes's lips curved in that sharp, wolfish smile of his. "Excellent. Then we are precisely where we must be." We followed the constable along the darkening path to the edge of the cliffs. Below us the channel churned, white foam gleaming in the half-light. The signal hut stood solitary against the wind, its lamp turning in slow, deliberate arcs. Holmes examined the mechanism, his eyes darting over the gears and glass. "Just as I suspected," he murmured. "The rotation has been tampered with. A second light hidden in the shutter projects an alternate pattern, one visible only to a trained observer at sea." "Ingenious and perilous," Lestrade cursed under his breath. "So they've been signaling right under our noses." "Not for long," Holmes said coldly. "Watson, hand me that wrench. If we alter the timing ever so slightly, we may compel a reply from the ship waiting offshore." As he worked, the beam flickered, once, twice, and then paused. A faint answering flash appeared far out at sea, a pulse of white in the darkness. "There," Holmes whispered. "The fish bites the hook. Now let us see who reels whom." For nearly an hour we waited, the wind howling about us, the beam slicing through the mist like a blade. Then at last we saw it, a small vessel emerging from the fog, its lanterns darkened, gliding silently toward the shore. Holmes watched, every nerve taut. "Patience, gentlemen," he murmured. "Let them believe the shore is clear. When they land, we shall see the face of the man who calls himself a friend of the sea." The boat drew nearer, its hull scraping the stones of the inlet. 2 figures disembarked, one carrying a case, the other scanning the cliffs. Holmes motioned for silence, then stepped forward, his voice cutting through the wind like a pistol shot. "Good evening, gentlemen. You've come a long way to find an audience for your light show." The taller of the two spun round, his hand going instinctively to his coat, but Lestrade and the constable were upon them in an instant. The case fell open, spilling a tangle of coded papers and compact signalling lamps. Holmes stooped, retrieving one of the devices. Portable lenses, replicas of those used at Dover. The design is identical. And look here, the same phosphorus oil. We have found our network indeed. The man struggled against his captors, his accent thick and furious. "You think you've won? There are others. You can't stop the tide." Holmes regarded him coolly. "Perhaps not. But the tide, my good man, obeys the moon, and I have a habit of predicting both." As the prisoners were led away, Holmes turned toward the dark expanse of sea. The waves crashed below, relentless, eternal. "Watson," he said quietly, "the light deceives, yet it also reveals. For every shadow it casts, there is a truth it cannot hide. I fear our work upon these shores is far from over." The wind rose again, carrying the scent of the sea and something colder still, an unseen presence that lingered beyond the waves, waiting, as though the game was not yet fully played. We did not return to London that night. The constable's quarters were ill-suited to rest, and yet Holmes seemed to thrive upon discomfort when a mystery still clung to the air. He had spent the better part of an hour examining the seized signalling apparatus, spreading its components across the rough wooden table of the small station room, the lamplight reflecting off the brass fittings. Lestrade, still flushed with his recent success, stood nearby nursing a cup of lukewarm tea, while I, half frozen from the wind off the channel, watched Holmes with a mixture of admiration and foreboding. He moved with mechanical precision, holding each lens to the light, examining the curvature and markings, occasionally muttering to himself in that rapid undertone which I had come to recognize as the language of deduction in its purest form. Then suddenly he straightened, his eyes gleaming with the unmistakable fire of discovery. "Watson," said he, "do you perceive this engraving upon the inner ring? At first glance it appears no more than the manufacturer's mark, but it is in fact a cipher." Lestrade bent forward, squinting. "A cipher, you say?" "Looks like nothing more than a serial number to me." Holmes smiled thinly. "That is precisely its genius. Observe the pattern. 3 digits, a dash, 2 letters, another dash, then 3 more digits. To the untrained eye it signifies production code, yet the repetition across these lamps and across those recovered at Dover reveals deliberate variation. This is no mere numbering. It is a message encoded in mechanical sequence. He produced a sheet of paper and began scribbling rapidly. Each alteration in the central pair of letters, AH, BH, CH, and so on, corresponds to the rotational setting of the lens. By calculating the difference in degrees, we derive a series of intervals. These intervals, in turn, form a transposed alphabet. Ingenious. The design allows information to travel not through words, but through light itself. Lestrade stared, incredulous. So you mean to say they were passing written messages with the lighthouses? Not written, Inspector, shining. Each rotation, each flicker, each pause was a letter in a conversation that spanned the channel. A system far subtler than telegraph lines and less liable to interception. These devices were built to calibrate the code precisely between collaborators on both shores. This, he tapped the brass ring lightly, is the skeleton key of their operation. The implication struck us all at once. The conspirators' network had not merely used the lighthouses as cover. They had engineered the very instruments of navigation into tools of treachery. Lestrade exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. Good Lord! And how many of these devices do you think are still out there? Holmes did not answer immediately. His eyes had gone distant, calculating. At least 4 others, if the sequence of these markings be complete. One of them, I suspect, is in London. In London, I cried. But what use could they have for a lighthouse there? Not a lighthouse, Watson, a tower. A high vantage, capable of sending signals across distance without suspicion. Tell me, does it not strike you as odd that the last correspondence was addressed to me personally? Our adversary wished to draw attention inland. The final act of this drama, my dear fellow, will not play upon the coast. The following morning we boarded the first train back to the capital. Holmes sat in thoughtful silence, the rhythmic clatter of the rails punctuated only by the soft scratch of his pencil across the paper upon which he traced the pattern of light intervals. When he finally spoke, his tone was calm but edged with steel. The cipher ends in an alignment consistent with the angle of the Thames's flow, east by northeast. And there, if memory serves, stands a structure most suited to their design, the old signal tower at Greenwich. It was decommissioned some years ago when electrical lines took precedence. A lonely building seldom visited, yet perfectly placed for communication with vessels on the river. Lestrade gave a low whistle. You think they're using that as their next relay? Holmes inclined his head. I think they mean to use it for something far more decisive. By nightfall we had reached Greenwich. The mist clung low to the water, and the moonlight shimmered faintly on the slow-moving current. The old signal tower loomed above us, its upper windows black and lifeless, the silhouette of its lantern room faint against the sky. A single watchman, startled by our arrival, admitted us after Lestrade produced his credentials. The interior was dust-choked and cold, the scent of oil and rust lingering in the air. Holmes led the way, his lantern casting long, wavering shadows up the iron stair. We reached the lantern room at last, where the glass panes creaked faintly in the wind. There upon the floor stood a familiar shape, the same type of portable signaling apparatus we had seized before, connected by wire to a small battery and a coil of copper tubing. Holmes examined it closely, his expression grim. We are too late for the first phase, he said quietly. The device is primed for transmission. The question remains to whom? He knelt, adjusting the dial upon the lamp. The beam sprang to life, slicing through the mist toward the river. After a brief pause, another light flickered in answer from far downstream. Holmes watched, his lips moving silently as he counted the intervals. Then he snapped the lens shut. The same code, he murmured. They're attempting to relay the signal to a vessel moored beyond Tilbury. That ship carries the remaining devices, or worse, the plans to reproduce them. We must stop it before dawn. We raced down the stair and out into the night. Within the hour, a small police launch had been secured, and we sped downriver under the pale light of the moon. The wind tore at our coats, and the lamps along the embankment passed in a blur. Holmes stood at the bow, eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. There! Lestrade cried suddenly. Our shadow loomed across the water, a small cargo vessel, its lights dimmed, moving with deliberate slowness. Holmes gave a sharp nod. Cut the motor! Drift closer. We approached in silence, the waves lapping softly against the hull. When we were within 100 feet, Holmes raised the bullseye lantern he had carried since the lighthouse at Dover. He adjusted the shutter, sending a brief, precise pattern of flashes across the water. A moment later, the ship's deck answered with a similar sequence, and then, realizing the deception, the light vanished. A shout rose, followed by the scrape of feet and the thud of boots. "Now, Lestrade," Holmes called, and in an instant we were upon them. The launch surged forward, colliding with the vessel's side. The policeman leapt aboard, batons drawn. In the confusion, I saw Holmes vanish into the shadows near the bridge. A shot cracked through the night, the sound echoing along the river. But when the smoke cleared, Holmes reappeared. Dragging a figure into the open, he threw the man against the rail, his voice cold as ice. "So, Mr. Talbot, the assistant from the Dover maintenance crew." "I might have known," the prisoner spat, defiant. "I have no proof," Holmes's eyes flashed. "On the contrary, I have your cipher, your devices, and your associates under arrest. The light you built to betray your country has, instead, illuminated your own guilt. By the time dawn broke over the Thames, the vessel and its contents were seized, the final pieces of the conspiracy laid bare. The signaling scheme had been designed to transmit naval intelligence, routes, schedules, and patrol codes to agents abroad. The death at the lighthouse, the tampered mechanisms, and the coded engravings, all threads in the same intricate web. As we stood upon the quay, the first rays of sunlight glinting across the water. Holmes lit a cigarette, his gaze distant and thoughtful. "You see, Watson," he said softly, "mystery like light depends upon contrast. Without darkness there can be no revelation, and without deception no truth worth uncovering." He turned then, coat swirling in the chill morning air. "Come, my dear fellow. The tide has turned, and I fancy Mrs. Hudson will have kept breakfast warm. Our work for the moment is done." And as we made our way back toward the waiting cab, I could not help but feel that somewhere in the silent rhythm of the river's current, the faint echo of the lighthouse still called, a reminder that even the brightest beacon can cast the darkest shadow. London had awakened to a pale, mist-veiled dawn by the time we returned to Baker Street. The previous night's events seemed to cling to us like the river fog, and though Lestrade had departed for the yard with his prisoners and the evidence, Holmes remained curiously restless. He did not, as was his custom after a triumph, collapse into his chair with violin and cigarette. Instead, he paced the length of our sitting room, with hands clasped behind his back, his features set in an expression of deep unease rather than satisfaction. I had assumed that the case, with all its intricacies, had now reached its conclusion. The agents apprehended, their method of communication exposed, the network dismantled. What more could there be? Yet as I watched Holmes stride back and forth before the hearth, I knew that something continued to gnaw at that remarkable intellect of his. "You are not content." "Holmes," I ventured at last, setting aside the cup of tea Mrs. Hudson had left for us. "Surely the affair is settled. The Foreign Office will regard this as one of your most valuable services." Holmes halted and turned toward me, the faintest trace of irritation in his eyes. "Settled, you say?" "My dear Watson, I abhor that word when used prematurely. You speak as though the curtain had fallen, when in truth, the play has merely paused between acts." He crossed to the table where the ciphered lamps and engravings lay, still glinting dully in the light that filtered through the fog. "We have captured instruments, yes. We have exposed a means of communication. But we have not uncovered the mind behind it all, the architect who conceived this system of deception. The men we seized are implementers, not designers. That, Watson, is what disturbs me." I frowned. "But surely Talbot, the supposed assistant from Dover, was the leader." Holmes gave a short, dry laugh. "A leader, perhaps, in the same way a conductor follows the composer's score. Talbot was intelligent enough to coordinate others, but he lacked the intellectual precision to invent a code of this sophistication. No, somewhere there remains a hand unseen, a mind capable of blending optical science, military precision, and psychological subtlety. Until I find that hand, I shall not rest easy." He turned abruptly, moving to his writing desk. "Lestrade's men will be interrogating Talbot even now. I have sent word that any statement he makes should be telegraphed here immediately. I would wager my Stradivarius that the name of our true adversary will not pass his lips, because he does not know it." Before I could reply, There came a sharp rapping at the door below. Holmes's head lifted like that of a hunting dog catching scent. Moments later, Mrs. Hudson appeared with a telegram upon a tray. Holmes tore it open, his eyes darting over the lines. He said nothing for several seconds. Then, in a tone of grim satisfaction, he read aloud, "Talbot refuses to speak. Requests you by name, claims you already know his master's symbol." "Lestrade." Holmes's gaze darkened. "His master's symbol," he murmured. "Intriguing. It suggests identity concealed by emblem, a calling card of intellect, perhaps arrogance." He strode to the table, seizing one of the brass lenses. "Watson, fetch me the magnifier." I complied, and together we bent over the device. Holmes examined the inner surface of the metal ring where the cipher markings ran. Then, quite suddenly, he drew in, "Here. Observe this faint engraving, nearly worn away by friction, an insignia of intertwined letters." "Do you see it?" I peered closer. "It appears to be an S enclosed within a triangle, or perhaps the letter A." "Both," Holmes said softly. "A monogram concealed within geometry, the signature of intellect attempting to hide behind abstraction." He moved to his files, rifling through drawer after drawer until he found a thin, yellowed folio. "I have encountered this mark before, years ago. It belonged to a man named Silas Arkwright, a mathematician and engineer of some renown, expelled from the Admiralty's Experimental Division for espionage. He vanished shortly thereafter, believed to have fled abroad. Yet I have reason to believe he returned under another identity." I felt a chill of recognition. "Then it was Arkwright who designed the code?" "Unquestionably. The precision of the cipher bears his intellectual signature. And this symbol, it is both boast and warning. He means for me to find it, Watson. The game is not over. It is merely deepening." He began to pace again, his mind clearly racing. "Arkwright was last traced to the continent, operating under aliases in Belgium and France, dealing in optical instruments. If he has indeed returned, it will not be to resume old crimes, it will be to conclude them. And where better to observe both the sea and the city than from the very place his enemy, myself, calls home?" I could not suppress a shiver. "You mean he's in London?" Holmes looked toward the window, where the fog rolled thick against the glass. "I mean, Watson, that he has always been in London. The letter we received, the one signed 'A Friend of the Sea,' that was his hand. He knew we would trace it to Dover. He wished to draw us outward, to expose the outer circle of his scheme while he himself remained hidden at its center." He turned suddenly, his eyes alight. "Watson, we must go, quickly. There is one place where the circle closes, the optical firm of Lambert & Co.'s on Fleet Street. They supplied the Admiralty with lenses during Arkwright's tenure and were suspected of passing duplicates to foreign buyers. If Arkwright has resurfaced, he will do so there." Within minutes we were in a cab rattling through the mist-veiled streets. The gas lamps glowed like blurred halos as we passed, and the hum of the city grew louder as we approached the river. Holmes sat rigid, his gaze fixed straight ahead, his lips moving soundlessly. I could see that curious transformation overtaking him, the sharpening of purpose that made him seem carved from pure intellect. Fleet Street lay dim beneath the morning haze when we arrived. Lambert & Co. was an unassuming building, its sign weathered, its windows shuttered. Holmes bade the cabman wait and motioned for me to follow. We entered by a side door that yielded to his touch with suspicious ease. Inside, the air smelled of dust and machine oil. The workshop beyond was filled with the gleam of brass instruments, compasses, mirrors, prisms, all neatly arranged upon wooden benches. Holmes moved soundlessly through the room, examining every surface. Then he stopped before a long work table littered with sketches and fragments of glass. He touched one drawing lightly with his fingertips, and when he turned it toward the light, I saw what it represented. A complex system of mirrors and lenses arranged not for navigation, but for projection. "A signal array," he whispered. "But here the configuration is reversed. Instead of sending light outward, it focuses inward." I frowned. "For what purpose?" He glanced at me, his eyes gleaming. "To observe, Watson. To record light instead of casting it. In short, a surveillance apparatus. He has not abandoned his science, he has perfected it." Just then, from somewhere behind the inner door came the faint creak of a floorboard. Holmes froze, then gestured for silence. The air seemed to tighten around us. Another step, soft, deliberate, then the click of a latch. Holmes moved like lightning, crossing the room in 2 strides and flinging open the door. In the narrow passage beyond stood a tall, gaunt man in a dark coat, his face pale beneath the lamplight, eyes cold and keen as glass. He did not startle. He merely smiled. "Mr. Holmes," he said softly, "I was wondering when you would return to the light." Holmes regarded him steadily. "Silas Arkwright, I presume." The man inclined his head with a faint air of amusement. "Once, perhaps. Names are but reflections. You of all men should understand that." "Your reflections," Holmes replied evenly, "have cost innocent lives. The keeper at Beachy Head, Graves, was murdered to conceal your theft. You have used light to deceive where it was meant to guide." Arkwright's smile deepened. "Light, Mr. Holmes, reveals only what men are prepared to see. And your brilliance blinds you to what lies beyond logic. That will be your undoing." Before Holmes could reply, the man turned, his hand striking a concealed switch. The lamps around the room flared blindingly to life, and for an instant I saw 100 mirrored surfaces flash like knives. When my sight cleared, the passage was empty, the outer door swinging in the wind. Holmes sprang forward, but the alley beyond was already deserted. The fog swallowed all trace of movement, leaving only the echo of the man's retreat. Holmes stood motionless for several seconds, his expression unreadable. Then, with a quiet, almost grim satisfaction, he said, "So the lightkeeper has shown his flame at last. Very well, the chase begins anew." And as we stepped out into the mist-shrouded morning, I felt that the true heart of the lighthouse mystery had only now begun to reveal itself. The fog hung thick as wool across Fleet Street, swallowing sound and form alike, so that even the clatter of distant hooves seemed muffled by its weight. Holmes stood motionless in the alleyway, eyes narrowed into the pale void where Arkwright had vanished. His long, lean silhouette appeared carved from the mist itself, as if he were a figure painted in half-light, suspended between thought and pursuit. I waited in silence, scarcely daring to breathe until at last he turned, his features composed yet fierce with intent. "He has not gone far, Watson. A man like Arkwright does not rely upon fortune. He relies upon control. Every path of his escape has been calculated long before this moment." He strode back into the workshop, scanning the walls and benches with eyes that missed nothing. "Observe," he murmured, crouching by a stack of crates in the corner. "The dust here, disturbed within the last hour. The floor bears faint scratches. He has moved something heavy, and recently." I followed his gaze. The crates, though marked as containing optical lenses, seemed curiously ill-fitting to the rest of the room. Holmes seized one by the rim and heaved it aside with sudden vigor. Beneath it lay a wooden trapdoor, half concealed beneath sawdust and shavings. "Precisely as I surmised," he said, lifting the hatch to reveal a narrow stair spiraling downward into darkness. A faint current of cool air rose from below, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of the river. A secondary exit, one leading directly to the Thames. Without hesitation, he took a lantern from the workbench, lit it, and descended. I followed, the close air thick with the damp musk of brick and mildew. The stairs ended in a narrow passage of old stone, sloping toward the riverbank. Water dripped from the ceiling in a slow rhythmic cadence, echoing our footsteps. After several yards, the passage opened into a small chamber, a dock of sorts built into the embankment. A narrow boat floated upon the water, still rocking gently from recent disturbance. Holmes raised the lantern higher and studied the floor. "He was here not 5 minutes before us," he said. "Note the wet footprints leading away from the boat. The soles are narrow and finely made. Arkwright's without question." He turned, following the marks toward a side tunnel that slanted upward. "He's moving inland, likely toward higher ground, where the fog offers cover but the river grants quick retreat." We pressed on, emerging into an open yard, littered with broken crates and iron fittings. The surrounding warehouses loomed like silent sentinels, their windows black and unseeing. Somewhere beyond the river's edge came the faint toll of a ship's bell. Holmes stopped abruptly, raising a hand. "Hush!" Through the mist drifted the soft scrape of wood against stone, a door closing not 20 yards away. Holmes darted forward, lantern lowered, every movement deliberate and precise. We rounded a corner and came upon a narrow lane where an old warehouse stood half-shuttered. Its sign faded by years of neglect. "Lambert & Coote Storage, private access only." "He has returned to his lair," Holmes whispered. "We are upon him, Watson." We approached cautiously, our boots silent against the damp cobbles. Holmes examined the lock, then produced his slender knife, easing the latch with practiced finesse. The door yielded with a faint groan, revealing a vast interior cloaked in darkness save for a faint, wavering light deeper within. We advanced through rows of towering shelves stacked with boxes and machinery parts. The faint smell of oil mingled with something acrid, ozone perhaps, as though from an electrical discharge. Holmes motioned me to stay back. He crept forward, every sense alert. The figure bent over the table straightened slowly, as if aware of our presence all along. Arkwright turned, his gaunt features illuminated by the pale radiance of the contraption before him. "So predictable, Mr. Holmes," he said quietly. "You never could resist following the light." Holmes stepped into view, voice cool and measured. "And you, Arkwright, never could resist casting shadows. Surrender yourself. Your inventions will harm no one further." Arkwright's lips curved into a smile devoid of warmth. "Surrender? To whom, I wonder? The Yard, the government that branded me traitor, when I sought only to perfect their own science? No, Mr. Holmes, I will not crawl back into their service. The truth I have built here will outlive both of us." He turned to the device behind him, a construction of mirrors, coils, and polished lenses. At its center pulsed a concentrated beam of light, refracted and split across the walls in geometric patterns. "Behold," he said, his voice low with awe, "light itself, captured and manipulated to obey the will of reason. With this one could see across miles, perhaps across nations. Imagine what knowledge, what power lies within such precision." Holmes's tone sharpened. "Knowledge without conscience is a blade without a hilt, Arkwright, and you wield it blindly." "Blindness," Arkwright replied softly, "is a matter of perception." He reached toward the switch upon the console. Holmes moved instantly, lunging forward, but in that same instant the beam flared, dazzlingly bright. The air hummed with an electric vibration. The light struck a series of mirrors and burst outward in a cascade that filled the entire room. I shielded my eyes, half blinded. The glow faded as quickly as it had come, leaving us in near darkness once more. When I lowered my hand, Arkwright was gone. Holmes stood motionless before the smouldering device, smoke curling faintly from the glass. "He's used his own contrivance as a diversion," he muttered. "There must be another exit, quickly." We searched frantically, finding a door at the rear flung wide to the riverbank beyond. By the time we reached it, only the faint ripple of disturbed water remained. Holmes gazed out over the fog-shrouded Thames, the lantern light glimmering faintly upon the black surface. "He has escaped once more," I said, unable to conceal my frustration. Holmes shook his head slowly. "No, Watson, not escaped. He has retreated. This was never his endgame. That device was merely a prototype, a demonstration meant for me. He wished me to see what he has achieved, to understand the magnitude of his design. He is drawing me in, step by step, toward something greater." He turned away from the water, his face grimly set. "He will not vanish long. Men like Arkwright are too proud to remain unseen. He believes himself my equal, perhaps even my superior. Such a mind cannot resist the temptation to prove it." We made our way back toward Baker Street, as dawn struggled once more to pierce the fog. Holmes said little during the drive, save for one remark spoken almost absently as we crossed Westminster Bridge. "There is a pattern in his movements, Watson, a rhythm. Each reappearance marks a point along a larger arc, as though he traces a constellation across London itself. I mean to map those points, and when the figure completes its shape we shall find him waiting at its center." "And if we fail to reach him first?" I asked quietly. Holmes looked out toward the river, where the rising sun turned the mist to liquid gold. "Then, my dear Watson," he said, "London shall no longer belong to the living, but to the shadows that command its light." He leaned back against the seat, eyes half closed yet burning still with that fierce, inexhaustible fire of intellect. And as the cab rattled toward Baker Street, I could not shake the sense that the game had only just begun, that somewhere within the city's fog-veiled heart, Silas Arkwright watched and waited. His light kindled once more. The following week passed beneath a veil of tension that neither Holmes nor I could wholly dispel. London itself seemed to reflect the unease that haunted my friend. The fog heavier, the streets quieter, as though the very city waited in apprehension. Holmes spent most of those days in silence, bent over maps, chemical samples, and sketches of lenses so intricate that even I, long accustomed to his methods, could make little sense of them. At last, on the 7th evening, he pushed aside his notes and looked up. "Watson," he said quietly, "the pattern is complete." He gestured toward the map pinned upon our wall. Small red marks dotted the length of the Thames, curving inward from the docks toward Westminster. Each sighting, each theft, each fleeting encounter with Arkwright has followed this alignment. It is not random. It is a series of coordinates. And where do they converge? His finger landed upon a single point at the heart of the city. Trinity Wharf, the site of the old observatory abandoned these 10 years. It is there that Arkwright intends to conclude his experiment. An experiment, I echoed, that has already cost 2 men their lives. Holmes nodded gravely. And may cost many more if we do not reach him tonight. Within the hour, we were rattling through the lamplit streets toward the river. A bitter wind swept off the Thames, carrying with it the clang of distant buoys and the low, melancholy cry of foghorns. Trinity Wharf rose before us like a skeleton of iron and glass, its once proud dome fractured and dark. Holmes moved with quiet certainty, his lantern held low. "Observe, Watson, the footprints fresh in the frost. He came not an hour before us." We entered through a side door descending into the belly of the structure. The faint hum of machinery reached us first, a steady, vibrating pulse that seemed to make the very air tremble. As we turned a final corner, the source of the sound came into view. Arkwright stood at the center of the ruined observatory, surrounded by an array of mirrors and lenses, all converging upon a single metal tower. The air shimmered with light refracted through glass, casting shifting specters upon the walls. "You are late, Mr. Holmes," he said without turning. His voice echoed oddly, as though carried by the light itself. "But I knew you would come. The curiosity that drives you is stronger than fear, stronger even than reason." Holmes advanced slowly. "I speak as though reason were your enemy, Arkwright. Yet you have built your entire kingdom upon its laws." "Reason," Arkwright replied, finally turning toward us, "is a tool. But knowledge, pure knowledge, is liberation. The government rejected my discovery because they feared what could not be controlled. I will show them that light cannot be owned." He gestured toward the great lens above, now glowing with an unearthly brilliance. "When the mechanism aligns, every beam of light from the river to the palace will converge here, magnified 1,000-fold. For one moment, London will see the truth that only I have glimpsed." Holmes's tone was cool, but his eyes burned. "You mean to blind the city, to destroy it in your vanity?" Arkwright's smile flickered. "Destruction and revelation are but different faces of the same truth." Holmes stepped forward, hands clasped behind his back, as though he were addressing a lecture hall rather than a madman. "You forget, Arkwright, that light to reveal must also cast shadow. And it is in that shadow that your own guilt hides." Arkwright frowned. "Guilt?" Holmes' voice rose slightly, sharp and clear. "You speak of liberation. Yet every life you've touched has ended in chains. Graves, who discovered your theft. Durham, who sought to expose you. Even your assistant, whom you silenced when he questioned your methods. You speak of light, but you walk forever in darkness." For a moment, silence hung between them. Then Arkwright's composure cracked, his hands trembling at the controls. "They betrayed me," he cried. "They could not understand, none of them could. But you, Holmes, you see the pattern. You of all men must recognize the beauty of it." Holmes took another step. "Yes, I see it clearly, and I see how it ends." Even as he spoke, he reached into his coat and withdrew a small metal rod, one of the mirrored instruments he had carried from the lighthouse days earlier. With a swift motion, he flung it toward the central lens. The beam struck the polished surface, refracted sharply and split into a dozen directions. One lanced into the machinery itself. There was a blinding flash, a sound like thunder compressed into a single heartbeat, and then darkness. When my vision returned, the air was thick with smoke and the stench of burnt metal. The great tower had collapsed inward, its cables hissing like serpents in the debris. Arkwright lay upon the ground, his hand still outstretched toward the ruin of his creation. Holmes knelt beside him, feeling for a pulse. "Alive," he said softly. "Barely." Arkwright's eyes fluttered open, glassy with exhaustion. "It was beautiful," he whispered. "For a moment." "The whole city. Alight?" Holmes regarded him in silence. "For a moment, perhaps. But beauty divorced from humanity is but another form of ruin." As the constables arrived, Lestrade among them, his face pale with shock, Holmes turned away, gazing toward the shattered dome above. The first rays of dawn were filtering through the broken glass, scattering in 100 faint beams that shimmered across the wreckage. Lestrade clapped Holmes on the shoulder. "Well, Mr. Holmes, you've saved London from a spectacle it won't soon forget." Holmes smiled faintly. "If only the city understood how near it came to destruction by its own pursuit of brilliance." We returned to Baker Street later that morning. Holmes stood at the window, the fog at last lifting beyond the rooftops, the sunlight pale but steady. For a long while he said nothing. At last he turned to me. "Watson, do you know what most men fail to grasp about the nature of light?" "I can only imagine you'll enlighten me," I replied. "It reveals truth," he said, "but only to those willing to see it." Arkwright looked into the light and saw only his reflection. He turned back to the window, the ghost of a smile upon his lips. "The rest of us, my dear Watson, must learn to live by its gentler glow." And with that, he reached for his violin, drawing from it a low, reflective melody that mingled softly with the hum of the waking city, a city spared for now by the steady reason of one man's mind. Thus ended the affair of the secret of the Lighthouse murder, a case as brilliant in its conception as it was perilous in its revelation. And though many years have passed since that dawn over Baker Street, I cannot look upon a solitary beam of light striking the fog without thinking of Holmes and of the fragile balance between illumination and the darkness that forever waits beyond its edge. ChatGPT can make mistakes. Check important info.